You slaughtered human children. The galaxy soon faced humanity's darkest side. The signal came in the middle of my speech. I was standing at the central podium of the Galactic Conclave Station, 47 alien delegations watching me from curved tiers of seats that rose toward a domed ceiling made entirely of transparent alloy. The stars were visible through it. I remember thinking that was beautiful 2 weeks ago when I first arrived. Right now, in this moment, I could not look at them without feeling something cold move through my chest. I had been speaking for 11 minutes. My name is Ilara Voss, and I had spent 9 years preparing for that speech. 9 years of language courses, diplomatic briefings, cultural sensitivity training, and 18-hour days learning how to stand in a room full of beings who did not look like me and make them believe that humanity deserved a seat at the table. 9 years of patient, deliberate work toward a single morning. I was 3 sentences into the section about cooperative resource sharing when the earpiece in my left ear made a sound I had never heard before in a live situation. Not a beep, not a tone. It was a flat, continuous hum that every human diplomat is trained to recognize during their very first week of service. It meant stop everything. I stopped. The alien delegation stirred. The Vreth ambassador, a tall insectoid creature with a gray-green carapace and 4 jointed arms, tilted his angular head slightly in my direction. His compound eyes caught the podium light. The Keshari delegate, who looked something like a deep-sea creature given the ability to breathe filtered air, made a low sound that the translation module in my collar rendered as mild confusion. At the upper tiers, several of the smaller species shifted, picking up on the sudden change in the room without yet knowing why it had changed. I pressed the small button behind my ear. Voss here. The voice on the other end was Commander Leon Price, head of Earth's forward diplomatic security detail. Leon was not a man who spoke with emotion. In 3 years working alongside him, I had heard him raise his voice exactly once, when a delivery drone clipped his coffee off a table during a briefing. He had said one word, looked at the floor, and composed himself in about 4 seconds. I had found that reassuring ever since. He was not raising his voice now. He was doing something worse. He was speaking very, very slowly, the way people speak when they are working very hard to make sure each word arrives in the correct order, because the incorrect order could cause additional damage. Ilara, he said, we have a confirmed strike on Haddonmere. I stood perfectly still at the podium. The alien delegates waited. The chamber's ambient hum filled the silence between his words and mine. What kind of strike? I asked. Orbital, wide dispersal pattern. Civilian sectors only. A pause that felt like standing at the edge of something with no bottom. The farming settlements on the southern shelf are gone. The town of Caro is gone. We are still pulling numbers from the emergency beacon grid, but the early count is showing 4,200 confirmed signals that have stopped transmitting. I kept my hands at my sides. I kept my face neutral. I had been trained for exactly this kind of moment. The moment when you receive information that tries to knock you sideways while you are standing in front of 47 civilizations. The training was useful. It was not enough. Leon, I said, the Haddonmere Educational Settlement, the school colony on the eastern ridge. Another pause, slightly longer. The beacon grid shows 1,912 signals that stopped in the first 4 minutes, he said. Age range coding puts the majority of them under 12 years old. I put both hands flat on the podium surface. Not because I needed the support. Because I needed something solid to press against so that the sound I felt building in the center of my chest would not come out of my mouth in that chamber. Haddonmere was not a military installation. It was not a strategic resource point. It was not a weapons facility or a command hub or a communication relay. It was a farming moon, settled 22 years ago by families who wanted open land and clean air and a quiet place to raise children. It grew grain and raised cattle and had built, over 2 decades, a small but proud community that had produced some of the best agricultural engineers in the outer systems. The Haddonmere Children's Science Program had won a Galactic Youth Innovation Award 3 years running. I had given the congratulatory address at their third award ceremony. I had stood on a small stage in a room full of children and their parents and shaken hands with every finalist. One of those finalists was a 10-year-old girl named Poppy Crane. She had built a working miniature water recycler out of salvaged transport components and second-hand filtration mesh. And it actually worked, and she had grinned at me with a gap-toothed smile when I crouched down to her eye level and told her it was one of the most impressive pieces of engineering I had seen at any grade level anywhere. Poppy Crane's beacon had almost certainly stopped transmitting. "Who authorized the strike?" I asked, though I already knew the answer before Leon gave it. "Vreth Dominion Command. It has been publicly claimed within the last 20 minutes. They are calling it a border enforcement action." I looked up from the podium. The Vreth ambassador was still watching me. His mandibles were moving in a slow, rhythmic pattern. I had spent considerable time studying Vreth body language in the months before this summit, working with a specialist who had spent 6 years embedded with Vreth trade missions. The slow mandible rhythm was not a sign of curiosity or concern. It was the Vreth equivalent of a smile. He knew. He had known when he walked into this chamber this morning. He had sat in his designated seat through 11 minutes of my speech about peace and cooperation and the future of galactic partnership, and he had known, the entire time, that his government had already reduced 1,900 children to silence. I looked at him for a long moment. The Keshari delegate leaned toward their translator and murmured something too quiet for my module to catch. Several delegates in the middle tiers were exchanging gestures I did not have full readings for. The Toral Assembly representative had gone very still. The room was becoming aware that something had shifted in a way that went beyond normal procedural interruption. I straightened up. "Members of the Galactic Conclave," I said, and my voice came out steady, which surprised me more than it should have. "I must request an immediate recess. There has been an incident of extreme significance involving a human civilian settlement. I apologize for the interruption and ask for the chamber's understanding." The session erupted in low sounds across 47 species. Translation modules worked at full capacity. Council Speaker Dreth, a tall gray-furred being who had held the moderation chair for 11 years, raised a formal staff and called for order in 4 languages simultaneously. I did not wait for order. I stepped away from the podium and walked toward the exit corridor at a normal pace, chin level, shoulders steady. I did not run. I did not stop. I did not look at the Vreth ambassador again, because I knew with absolute precision that if I looked at him a second time in that moment, I would say something in front of 46 other civilizations that could not be unsaid, and would give his government exactly the kind of response they were hoping for. Leon met me in the corridor. He was a compact man with close-cropped dark hair and eyes that were, right now, not quite as steady as usual. He handed me a data tablet without speaking. I looked at the imagery from Haddonmere's orbital emergency cameras. The cameras had kept recording after the beacons went silent. Cameras do not have beacons. They do not stop. I looked at those images for 37 seconds. Then I handed the tablet back and said, "Get me a secure channel to Earth Command, not standard diplomatic frequency, military-grade encryption, direct line to General Hall's office." Leon looked at me carefully. "The Conclave is going to want a statement within the hour. Standard protocol requires." "The protocol," I said quietly, "was written before this happened." He went quiet. Then he nodded once and turned toward the communications bay. I stood alone in the corridor for a moment. Through the transparent wall panel to my left, the stars hung exactly where they had always hung, in perfect uninterested silence. Somewhere out there, 22 light minutes away at our current relative position. The moon called Haddonmere was dark, and still in a way it had never been before. I thought about Poppy Crane's gap-toothed smile. I thought about 1900 beacons going silent in 4 minutes. I pressed my hand flat against the cold transparency of the wall panel and held it there, and I made a decision that was not diplomatic and not measured, and not the product of 9 years of training. I decided that I was done being the only person in that building who fully understood what had just happened. I walked to the communications bay and sent General Hall a message 6 words long. They need to know what this means. I did not clarify who they were. I did not need to. Leon read it over my shoulder and said nothing. The duty operator transmitted it without comment. Then I went back to the corridor and stood there for a moment longer, because I needed 30 more seconds before I walked back into that chamber and resumed being a diplomat. 30 seconds to close the door on what I was feeling and reopen the door on what I was there to do. It was a skill I had practiced for years, and it had never been harder to perform than it was in that moment. The corridor lights hummed steadily overhead. My footsteps were quiet on the polished floor. Behind me, through the wall I had been pressing my hand against, the stars continued their silent and indifferent burning. Somewhere in the space between them, humanity was already waking up. I did not know yet what that would look like. I was about to find out. I will tell you what the conclave did first, because understanding their response is the only way to understand how badly every calculation in that chamber was about to fail. They called a formal session of inquiry. In galactic diplomatic practice, this is the institutional equivalent of a species responding to a burning building by forming a committee to discuss the fire. Council Speaker Dreth opened the floor with a prepared statement that used the phrase deeply regrettable 4 times across 6 carefully constructed sentences, which is an achievement in its own way. The session coordinator announced that the Vreth Dominion had submitted a written position statement in advance of the session, which meant they had prepared it before the news was even public, which told you everything you needed to know about how much advance notice the Vreth ambassador had received before he sat down and watched me give 11 minutes of a speech about peace. I sat in the human observer seat and read the Vreth written position on my data tablet while Dreth was still speaking. It was 2 pages. The relevant section was the 3rd paragraph. It read, "The Haddonmere enforcement action was conducted in response to unverified intelligence suggesting unauthorized military staging activity in the border region. The collateral impact on presentient biological units was an unforeseen outcome of otherwise legitimate border security operations. The Dominion regrets any confusion regarding the classification of the affected settlement. Presentient biological units. That was what the Vreth called the children of Haddonmere." I set the tablet down on the desk surface very carefully, with both hands, the way you set down something fragile when your hands are not entirely steady. Leon was seated 2 chairs to my left. He had read the same paragraph at the same moment. He did not look at me. He was staring at the chamber floor with his jaw doing something I had only seen it do once before, in a very different kind of briefing that had also ended with people making hard decisions in small rooms. The session ran for 4 hours and 11 minutes. In that time, the Keshari Federation issued a formal statement of concern that covered 3 paragraphs and contained the phrase inappropriate use of force twice and the phrase deeply regrettable once, making it marginally stronger in language than the conclave speaker's opening and significantly weaker than anything resembling accountability. The Murath Collective called for an independent investigation, which in conclave practice means a process that runs for 18 months and produces a report that is read by 17 people and filed. The Toral Assembly proposed the creation of a temporary review board. 9 other species submitted written expressions of solidarity with the human delegation, all of them carefully worded to avoid any language that could be construed as a direct criticism of the Vreth Dominion. Because the Vreth Dominion controlled 3 trade corridors that 6 of those 9 species depended on for 30% or more of their import infrastructure. I watched it all with the specific quality of attention that you develop when you have been doing this long enough to understand that the process itself is the point. These were not nations failing to respond to an atrocity. These were nations responding exactly as they had always responded to atrocities that did not directly threaten them. The machinery of galactic civilization was functioning precisely as designed. It was simply that the machinery had never before been applied to a situation involving humanity, and it did not yet know that it was handling the wrong kind of problem with the wrong kind of tools. The Vreth ambassador spoke once, near the end of the session. He stood at the floor podium in the characteristic Vreth formal posture, 2 primary arms folded, 2 secondary arms hanging loose, carapace angled slightly upward, and said, in the clipped translated register of Vreth Dominion Standard, "The Dominion acknowledges the emotional response of the human delegation and offers a formal expression of regret for any unintended civilian impact resulting from the border security operation." A formal expression of regret. Not an apology. In galactic diplomatic language, an expression of regret and an apology are not the same thing. An apology contains acknowledgement of wrong. An expression of regret says only, "I acknowledge that you have feelings about this outcome." It is the linguistic equivalent of telling someone that you are sorry they feel hurt, which any person with basic social awareness understands is not the same as being sorry for hurting them. The session coordinator logged the statement into the official record as a satisfactory initial response and moved to close the session. Several delegations expressed support for this progression of events. The Toral Assembly representative made a motion to schedule a follow-up inquiry for 30 days later, which passed with 31 votes. I had not spoken during the session. I had requested the floor twice and been passed over both times in favor of procedural motions. I understood this was not accidental. Then, while the session coordinator was still reading the closing formalities, my earpiece made a sound. Not the emergency hum. Leon's voice, very low, very controlled. It came in 3 minutes ago. Earth command. They did not route it through standard diplomatic channels. What channel? I asked, barely moving my lips. Every channel, Leon said, all frequencies, full translation suite, simultaneously. I sat very still. Earth Command had sent a message to every receiver in range of the Conclave station, on every known communication frequency, translated into 47 languages at the same moment. It had not been addressed to me. It had not been addressed to the Vreth ambassador. It had been addressed to everyone and to no one, which is a specific kind of communication that galactic civilization had no prior framework for, because it is not a demand, not a declaration, and not a negotiating position. It is something else entirely. Leon read me the full text through the earpiece. You have destroyed what we hold most precious. We do not bargain for what we have already decided. We are coming. There is nothing to discuss. That was the complete message. No formal diplomatic header. No reference to galactic law or treaty frameworks. No conditions attached. No timeline offered. No indication of what response, if any, would change the outcome. Just 3 statements delivered simultaneously to 47 civilizations, as clear and as final as a door closing. The session coordinator stopped speaking mid-sentence as the message registered across every diplomat's translation module at the same time. The chamber went silent. I had been in the Galactic Conclave chamber many times in the last 2 weeks. I had seen it loud, and I had seen it procedural, and I had seen it thick with the layered noise of 47 species processing information simultaneously. I had not seen it silent. I was not entirely sure it had ever been silent before. Then the Murath Collective's senior delegate, A broad-shouldered being with a voice like gravel being shifted across steel, said something in Murath that the translation module rendered as, "They are not making a demand." "No," I said quietly. I had not planned to speak. I simply spoke because the observation was correct and deserved a correct response, not a demand, a statement. Every delegate in that chamber turned to look at me. The Vreth ambassador turned to look at me. I met his compound-eyed gaze across the chamber floor and held it without looking away. "There is a difference," I said, addressing the full chamber rather than the Vreth specifically, between a species that threatens in order to negotiate and a species that announces because it has already decided. Humanity is not good at the first. We have spent several thousand years developing considerable capacity for the second. The Keshari delegate made a sound and then said, through their translator, "Ambassador Voss, is there any course of action available to this body that would create a different path forward from the one that appears to be developing?" I thought about Poppy Crane. I thought about 1900 beacons. I thought about the Vreth ambassador's mandibles making the slow rhythm that meant satisfaction while I stood at a podium talking about partnership. "You can step aside," I said. "That is the kindest option available to you right now. Clear the corridors between our fleets and the Vreth border, stay out of the space between us and the thing we are going to do, and let it reach its conclusion. That is what I recommend." Another wave of sound went through the chamber. Not panic exactly, though panic was present underneath it. Something more systemic. The sound of 46 civilizations simultaneously running new calculations. The Toral Assembly delegate raised a formal signaling rod. "Ambassador," he said, with the careful precision of someone who understood that the exact words mattered, "is humanity formally declaring war on the Vreth Dominion?" I looked at him directly. "No," I said. "Declaring war is what you do when you want the other side to understand that combat is possible and negotiate to prevent it. It is a political communication. It creates space for response. We are not creating space. Humanity is not doing something political right now." Quiet again. A Vreth aide on the far side of the chamber was working at a data screen with both primary hands moving quickly. I recognized the behavior. He was pulling records. He was searching something in a hurry, with the specific urgency of a person who has just realized they may not have the information they needed before now. He was reading human history. I almost felt something for him. Not quite sympathy. The closest word I have for it is recognition. He was doing now what his government should have done before they looked at a farming moon and decided its population did not count. Human history is not a document designed to make anyone feel better about having drawn our attention. I stood because the next part needed to be said standing. "The human delegation will relocate to the secondary station," I said. "We will maintain open communication with the conclave. We will honor every existing diplomatic framework that does not require us to pause what is already in motion. I ask one thing of this chamber before we go." 46 species waited. "Remember Haddenmere," I said, "not as a justification for anything, as a lesson. Remember that there are lines you do not cross with certain kinds of people, and remember that today in this room we told you plainly what happens when someone forgets that." I picked up my tablet and walked out. Leon fell into step behind me. We did not speak until the secure lift closed around us. He said, "Earth Command has already begun full mobilization." "How much?" I asked. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way he does when he is deciding how to say something. Then, "All of it," he said. I nodded. The lift hummed. "Leon," I said. "Yeah." "The Vreth aide, the one reading records, do you think he found anything useful?" Leon was quiet for a long time. "No," he said finally, "I do not think he did." The doors opened. We walked out into a corridor that was exactly the same as it had been an hour ago, and was also completely different. The way a room is different after something permanent happens in it. Somewhere in the dark between the stars, the first human ships were already moving with the particular kind of purpose that has no reverse gear, and does not look for one. This account is not mine. I want to be clear about that before you read further, because what follows requires a different kind of attention than my own narrative. What you are about to encounter is the recovered command log of Vreth Fleet Commander Veth Arak, senior officer of the Vreth Dominion's 4th Perimeter Defense Group. His log was retrieved from the command bay of a heavily damaged vessel after the final stage of the conflict, and translated by the Conclave's automated language systems over the course of several weeks. I received a copy 6 months after the conflict ended, in a plain document packet with no cover letter, from the Tribunal's evidence office. I read it in a small room on the Conclave station, alone, with the door closed, over a period of about 3 hours. I did not stop. I want to include it here in substantial form because my own account of those days is limited to what I witnessed from the Conclave station, and the perspective that comes from a Vreth military officer watching the human fleet arrive is not something I can replicate or approximate. It must be given as it was written. Veth Arak's log begins on the 14th day after the Haddenmere incident. Day 14. We have received confirmation that the human government has initiated full military mobilization. Dominion intelligence assessment projects between 60 and 90 standard days for humanity to assemble a meaningful strike formation. Command has authorized reinforcement of the 4th Perimeter with 2 additional fleet wings. I have requested a 3rd and submitted the request with a detailed tactical justification. The request is under review. The general assessment at command level continues to describe humanity as a mid-tier civilization with strong emotional rhetoric and limited strategic reach. I have submitted a secondary assessment. I am not confident it was read with the attention it required. Day 21. Long-range sensor arrays at beacon positions 7 and 11 have registered drive signatures at the outer edge of detection range. I want to note that the number of signatures is not consistent with the projections our intelligence models generated. I have submitted an updated count to command along with a formal request for clarification on current rules of engagement. I am awaiting response. The signatures are continuing to approach at a pace that does not suggest preparation for contact negotiation. Day 23. I need to correct my previous entry. The count I submitted on day 21 was not accurate, but not for the reason I initially assumed. Our sensor arrays were not malfunctioning. They were reading correctly. What I sent to command on day 21 was not the count for a forward scout formation. It was the count for the near edge of a larger formation. I have spent the last 2 days using composite imaging from 7 separate relay points to construct a fuller picture of what is in our approach corridor. I am recording this entry now and flagging it as priority urgent because I need someone at command to understand what I am looking at before we proceed further. There is a gap in the log at this point. 17 minutes of recording silence. Veth Arak resumes. The human fleet is not organized according to any tactical doctrine our models recognize. They have not deployed with a protected command corps supported by flanking wings, which is the standard formation for a civilized species conducting an aggressive advance. They have no visible command ship. They have no clear center. The best description I can produce in our language is this. Imagine that you are standing at the lowest point of a valley and you look up at the ridgeline above you, and instead of seeing individual soldiers standing on it, you see the entire ridgeline begin to move toward you. Not individuals. The ridge itself. That is what my composite imaging shows. A formation without a defined leading edge, extending beyond what my arrays can cleanly resolve at current range. moving at a rate that does not allow for the kind of deceleration that typically precedes an offer to negotiate terms. I have requested an emergency briefing with Dominion Command. I am waiting. Day 24. I received a communication from the Human Fleet Command at 0700. It was not encrypted. It was transmitted on open frequency in Dominion Standard Language. The complete text was, "Move aside or be moved aside. You have 4 hours." I forwarded this to Dominion Command with an attached recommendation and requested immediate guidance on response. I am still waiting as of this log entry. Day 24, second entry. I gave the order to break formation and clear the approach corridor. I want this recorded with complete clarity. I did not receive authorization. I made the decision unilaterally, at 17 minutes past the 4-hour deadline, because my tactical officers had spent those 4 hours running every viable engagement scenario in our library, and could not produce a single outcome in which holding our position resulted in anything other than the complete destruction of every vessel under my command, without meaningful impact on the human fleet's advance. I moved my wing aside. I am prepared to answer for this decision through whatever process command deems appropriate. I believe the record will show it was correct. 6 hours of silence. The human fleet has been passing my position for 4 hours. I have been watching on long-range imaging continuously. I want to record what I have observed, because I believe this log may be used at some future point to help other officers understand what happened in this region, and I want to be precise. The human vessels are not built according to the same logic as Vreth warships. Vreth warships are designed for sustained campaigns, for occupying space, for controlling territory over extended periods. They are tools of continued presence. The human vessels I have watched move past my position for 4 consecutive hours are not designed for any of those purposes. The closest word I have in our language for what they are is the word we use for a conclusion that has already been reached. They are not instruments of pressure or negotiation. They are instruments of outcome. Each human vessel carries weapons infrastructure that, in our doctrine, would require an entire fleet's worth of external support to sustain. They carry that infrastructure internally. They require no resupply lines. They require no communication chains back to a central command hub. Each vessel operates as though it is the only vessel in existence and is designed to complete its task without assistance. This is an approach to military engineering that our doctrine does not have a category for, because our doctrine assumes that building a force this self-sufficient across hundreds of individual vessels would require a civilization to restructure itself entirely around warfare, which no civilized species would choose to do. I do not know how humanity built hundreds of these vessels while maintaining a functioning civilian society. I cannot explain it. I can only record that it is what I observed. There is one more observation I want to include in this log, and it is the one I expect to be discussed the most if this record is ever read by people trying to understand what happened here. They are not angry. I have served as a military officer for 22 years. I have observed angry fleets. I know what they look like. Angry forces move with urgency. They accelerate past optimal approach speed. They make small errors because emotion introduces miscalculation into tactical decision-making. They react to variables in ways that are sometimes advantageous and sometimes catastrophic, but always human in the broad sense, driven by feeling rather than pure calculation. The human fleet passing my position is not angry. There is no detectable urgency in their movement patterns. There are no communication anomalies that suggest elevated stress states in the command structure. They are moving through our space the way a river moves through a valley, not because it is angry at the valley, but because this is the direction it goes, and it has sufficient volume to go there regardless of what the valley would prefer. That quality, the complete and total absence of doubt, is the most unsettling thing I have observed in 22 years of military service. Doubt is what creates the space in which negotiation is possible. Doubt is what makes a force hesitate long enough to receive a message and consider changing course. There is no doubt in that fleet. There is no space. The Vreth Dominion built its military doctrine on a foundational assumption that every spacefaring civilization had arrived at the stars by learning certain things about violence, by learning that overwhelming it is wasteful, that restraint produces better long-term outcomes than maximum force, that a civilized species conducts its conflicts with measured escalation and always leaves a door open for a negotiated conclusion. We assumed humanity had learned these same things. We were wrong, and I want to be precise about the nature of the error, because I do not think it was a simple one. Humanity did not arrive at the stars by becoming peaceful. They arrived at the stars while carrying everything their history had produced, all of it. The capacity for extraordinary creativity and the capacity for absolute decisive force existed in them simultaneously, and they had learned not to eliminate one in favor of the other, but to contain both, to keep the capacity for decisive action stored safely, available, maintained in working condition, in the hope of never needing it, combined with the absolute commitment to use it completely when the conditions that would require it were met. We provided those conditions. They are using it. I do not know what comes after this. I do not know if there will be a Vreth Dominion to return to when this situation reaches its end. I am recording this in the hope that whoever reads it will understand one thing clearly. This was not inevitable. This was chosen, not by humanity, by us, by the specific decision to look at a civilian settlement and categorize its inhabitants as units below the threshold of consequence. That decision is what the human fleet is responding to, not ambition, not territorial expansion, not strategic calculation, a decision made by people who believed that some lives do not count. End of Veth Arak's recovered log. I set it down when I finished reading it the first time and sat with it for a while. Then, I read the final 3 paragraphs again. I think about those paragraphs often, even now, about what it means that a Vreth military officer, watching the fleet that was about to end his civilization's military existence, used his last recorded thoughts to describe precisely why it was happening and to name the decision that caused it. He understood. In the end, he understood exactly. Understanding something too late is one of the most human experiences I can name. Apparently, it is not exclusively human. The conflict moved to its final stage. The question that remained was not whether humanity would win. The question was what humanity would do with winning. That question fell to a group of people in a room on a conclave station, arguing over one decision that would define what kind of species we were going to be when it was over. I was in that room. I was not sure, going in, which side would carry the vote. I am still not entirely sure we chose correctly, even now. But I will tell you what we chose, and why, and what I said to make the argument. The room where humanity decided what kind of species it was going to be is not impressive. I have thought about this a great deal over the years, because people expect these moments to happen in grand places. They expect high ceilings and formal chambers and the weight of history pressing down visibly from above. The room where we had the most important argument of my professional life had a scratched conference table, 12 mismatched chairs, a wall display that kept dimming without warning, and a coffee dispenser in the corner that made a sound like a small distressed animal every time it completed a cycle. 3 people flinched every time it went off. By the 4th hour, nobody flinched anymore. We had all stopped noticing it, which felt like a metaphor for something, though I was too tired to work out what. General Hall sat at the head of the table. He was a large man with a shaved head and reading glasses he consistently forgot he was wearing, and he had the kind of voice that fills a room without being raised, the way a bell fills a space, not by pushing but by resonating. I had worked alongside him for 4 years before Hadenmere, and respected him as much as I had respected anyone in that kind of position. That made the hours that followed considerably harder than they would have been with someone I did not respect. The conflict was, in practical terms, over. The Vreth Dominion's military command had collapsed in a time frame that exceeded even the most optimistic human projections. The Outer Worlds had sent formal capitulation notices within 9 days. The middle ring of populated systems had followed within 3 weeks. The Dominion's inner worlds were still transmitting defiant statements, but the statements were becoming shorter with each transmission cycle, which is a reliable indicator that the people writing them are running out of conviction rather than vocabulary. The Vreth homeworld had not been touched. That was the subject of the meeting. Around the table, along with General Hall and myself, were 4 additional military commanders, 2 senior policy officers named Gwen Carter and Alan Doyle, who had both been working without adequate sleep for 3 weeks and looked it, a strategic ethics specialist named Dr. Philip Rose, who had been flown in from Earth at considerable urgency, and had arrived with the particular alertness of someone who knows their expertise has just become critically necessary. 3 conclave liaison observers from non-human species who were officially present as observers and were doing significantly more than observing, and Leon, who sat 2 seats to my right with a tablet in his hands and the expression of a man who has been awake too long and knows it, and has decided that stopping is not currently an option. General Hall opened without ceremony. The Vreth homeworld has a current estimated population of approximately 2.3 billion. Military and governmental infrastructure accounts for roughly 4% of the total surface area. The remaining 96% is civilian residential, agricultural, industrial, and educational. Our orbital assets are in verified position. Coverage is complete. What we do not yet have is a decision on how to use that position. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Colonel Ruth Payne, the most senior military commander at the table after Hall, said the thing that everyone else had been carefully not saying. The position at Earth Command among the senior strategic group is that a demonstration of capability is the appropriate next step, something that removes ambiguity about the consequences of this kind of action, something permanent. Dr. Rose said, "When you say demonstration," Colonel Payne said, "a deterrent, meaningful and final, something every civilization that observed these events looks at and understands as the established cost of crossing a human civilian target." Gwen Carter said, very quietly, 2.3 billion people. They supported the Dominion, Colonel Payne said. They voted for the government. They sent children to military academies. They celebrated the border enforcement campaigns in public media. Some portion of them did, Alan Doyle said. Some portion of any population supports the worst decisions of its leadership, while the rest go about daily life without full awareness of what is being done in their name. The children of Hadenmere did not have full awareness of what was being done in their name, Colonel Payne said. They did not have the option of going about daily life. The room went quiet again, the specific quiet of a group of people who are all thinking the same complicated thing, and none of them are ready to say it out loud yet. I had not spoken. I was watching the conclave liaison observers, because alien observers at human meetings carry a particular quality of attention that I have learned to read over years of practice. Vel Ath, the Keshari liaison who had spoken to me after the session 10 days ago, was completely still in the way Keshari become still when they are deeply alarmed, and are using the stillness to manage it. The Murath observer had both hands flat on the table surface. The young Toral delegate named Sen, who was the most junior person in the room and almost certainly had not expected to be in any room where this kind of conversation happened for at least another decade, was looking between the human faces around the table, with an expression the translation module rendered simply as fear. Not fear of the Vreth, fear of us. I held that observation for a moment before I spoke. General Hall, I said, may I ask a question before we continue? He nodded. What is the goal? I said. Not the method. The goal itself. What specific outcome do we want to have produced 10 years from now, 20 years from now, for humanity and for every other civilization in this part of the galaxy? General Hall looked at me the way he always looks at questions he is taking seriously, which is to say he looked at the table for a moment before he looked at me. Safety, he said. The security of human worlds and human lives. The assurance, as permanent as we can make it, that no civilization in this galaxy will look at a human settlement and assess attacking it as an option worth considering. Agreed, I said. That is exactly the goal. So let me describe 2 paths toward it and ask which one gets us there. I stood up, because arguments like this need to be made standing. Path 1, I said. We use what we have in orbit in the way Colonel Payne is describing. We make the demonstration. Maximum clarity, maximum finality. Every civilization in the galaxy watches, and they understand immediately, in a way that requires no further explanation, what humanity is willing and capable of doing in response to this kind of provocation. I let that land. The immediate result would be absolute, I continued. No civilization would directly challenge us for a generation, very possibly 2. The fear would be genuine and total and not misplaced, because it would be based on real evidence. I am not dismissing that. It would work in the specific sense of preventing direct attack for a substantial period of time. I paused. But here is what else happens. Every civilization in this galaxy would simultaneously begin to ask a question they cannot avoid. If humanity did this to the Vreth, what would stop them from doing it to us? The answer they would arrive at is, nothing except our continued good behavior and their continued inoffensiveness. And civilizations that live under that kind of assessment do not become partners. They do not become allies. They become sources of quiet, patient, long-term strategic threat. Because the most dangerous kind of adversary is one that smiles at you while waiting for the right combination of opportunity and necessity. I looked around the table. Path 2, I said. We stop at the threshold. We hold complete orbital dominance over the Vreth homeworld, and we do not fire on civilian infrastructure. We require full unconditional surrender. We require complete cooperation with a formal war crimes process. We dismantle the Vreth military apparatus entirely and replace Dominion governance with a supervised transitional structure. This is slower. It is significantly more resource-intensive. It requires years of difficult and often thankless work. I took a breath. But the story that every other civilization in this galaxy tells, afterward and for as long as the story is told, is not the story of a species that burned a world. It is the story of a species that had the capability to burn a world, chose not to, and still achieved everything it set out to achieve. That is a completely different story. It does not make 46 civilizations afraid of us as a threat. It makes them afraid to be on the wrong side of us, which is a fear with a clear solution. Do not do the thing that caused this. That solution is available to everyone. It does not require them to manage us as an existential danger. It requires them only to not attack our children. The room was quiet in a new way. Dr. Rose was looking at me with an expression I could not fully categorize. Leon had set his tablet down on the table. The young Toral Delegate Sen had stopped looking at the other faces and was now looking only at me. General Hall said, "You are asking this group to exercise restraint at the precise moment when we have no obligation to exercise it." "Yes," I said, "because restraint exercised when there is no obligation to exercise it is the only kind that means anything to anyone watching. It is the only demonstration of character that cannot be explained away as limitation or incapacity. Everyone in this galaxy knows we have the capability. The question they are asking right now is whether we have the judgment. And the answer to that question, will define every interaction we have with every civilization in this part of the universe for the next century. Colonel Payne said, and if we are wrong, if restraint reads as weakness, if some other dominion looks at this moment and concludes that we stopped because we ran out of will. It was a real question. I could hear that she was not arguing, she was asking. Then we demonstrate otherwise when it becomes necessary, I said, and we do it knowing that every civilization that witnessed this moment will understand, with full certainty, that what happened here was a choice. A deliberate, considered choice made by people who had every other option available and selected this one. There is no species in this galaxy that will misread us after what we have already shown them. The only question is what we want them to understand about what we do when we have power and choose how to use it. General Hall called the vote. The room was quiet while each person indicated their position. Leon read the result quietly into my ear because I was watching the observers and not the tally. 7-5, restraint. General Hall looked at the result for a moment. Then he said, restraint carries. We proceed with full unconditional surrender demand and transition to tribunal process. I want terms drafted in 3 hours. Let's get to work. People moved toward the door. Velath stopped beside me on the way out. The Keshari do not make physical contact across species without explicit mutual invitation, but Velath paused close enough that I could hear the quiet rhythm of their breathing filters. Ambassador Voss, Velath said, I want you to know that I will be including a full account of this meeting in my report to the Keshari Council. I assumed so, I said. Not the outcome, Velath said. The conversation, the argument, the duration of it, the fact that it was close, the fact that it happened at all, that humanity sat in a room with complete capability to do the worst imaginable thing and spent 4 hours arguing about whether it was right. I want them to understand that the argument occurred and what was said in it. I looked at them. Does that change how the Keshari see us? Velath was quiet for a moment. It changes how I see you, they said carefully. I cannot speak for the council, but it changes something. They moved toward the door. I watched them go. Leon came to stand beside me in the quiet of the room. 7-5, he said. Yes, I said. It was close, he said. Yes. A pause. Are you certain we were right? I thought about the question with the full weight it deserved. I thought about Haddenmere and Poppy Crane and the memorial that did not exist yet but would. I thought about becoming the thing you set out to punish. No, I said honestly. I am not certain. I believe we made the better choice. I believe the evidence 10 years from now will support it. But I am not going to claim certainty, because the moment I become certain is the moment I stop asking whether I should be. And that is how you arrive at the kind of decision that reduced 1900 beacons to silence. Leon considered this. Then he nodded once and we walked out into the corridor together. The stars were visible through the far wall panel. They were always visible from this station. I had stopped thinking they were beautiful and started thinking they were simply real, present, permanent. The same stars that had watched humanity climb out of its history and into a galaxy that was not ready for what it found. We had just chosen not to give the galaxy a reason to fear us more than it already did. I hoped we were right. I thought we were. I was not certain. That uncertainty, I had decided, was not a weakness. It was the most honest thing about us. 10 years change everything and nothing, and I mean that specifically. I do not mean it as comfort. I do not mean it as a way of saying that time softens things, because it does not entirely, and anyone who tells you it does has not stood in front of a memorial on a rebuilt moon, and read 1900 names carved into dark stone on a clear afternoon with oak trees overhead. I mean it technically. The external shape of things changes thoroughly, while the things underneath remain exactly what they were, which means you carry them forward into the new shape of the world and learn to hold them differently without ever setting them down. My name is still Ilara Voss. I am 51 years old. I have gray in my hair that was not there a decade ago and a specific quality behind my eyes that is not the same as exhaustion. It is more like the weight of having witnessed a sufficient number of things that cannot be made smaller by time, only carried more efficiently. I have learned to carry them efficiently. It is a skill, like any other, that improves with practice. I am the first human being to hold a permanent seat on the Galactic Conclave Security Council. The position was created 18 months after the Vreth conflict ended, by unanimous vote of 46 delegations. It is the first unanimous vote the Conclave has recorded in its 400-year institutional history. I was told, by Council Speaker Dreth's office, that this was an extraordinary distinction. I understand that it is also a form of very deliberate inclusion, bringing the thing the galaxy is uncertain about into the room where decisions are made, rather than leaving it outside the door. I find both things true simultaneously and see no reason to choose between them. Let me tell you what the 10 years actually contained. The Vreth homeworld surrendered on the 31st day of the conflict. The formal surrender was delivered by Veth Mora, senior speaker of the Vreth High Council, who stood before a human fleet in full orbital position, and recited the complete terms of unconditional capitulation without pause. The translator who was present told me afterward that Veth Mora's voice did not waver at any point during the reading, which is a detail I have thought about many times. I was not in the room. I was watching the transmission from the Conclave station, and I noted that thought about Veth Mora's composure, and filed it as important, because I think it is necessary to recognize the quality in an adversary even at the moment of their absolute defeat, and I think failing to do so says something unflattering about the person failing to do it. The War Crimes Tribunal began 8 weeks after the surrender. It was conducted by a joint panel of human and conclave jurists, with full Vreth legal representation for the defense. It ran for 3 years, which is not unusual for proceedings of this complexity, and was contested and procedurally difficult throughout, requiring 18 separate amendments to its operating framework. The final verdicts named 42 Vreth government and military officials as directly responsible for the Haddenmere strike, and for a broader pattern of civilian targeting that the investigation revealed predated Haddenmere by 11 years. The incident that brought consequences was not, it turned out, the first of its kind. Only the one that finally involved the wrong population. The dismantling of the Vreth military apparatus took 2 years under joint oversight. That oversight mission is still technically active, scaled down significantly but maintained, because history suggests that a supervision process ended too early is not a supervision process but an optimistic gesture. The Vreth homeworld and its associated populated systems are now governed by an elected transitional council. This is the first elected governing body in Vreth history, introducing democratic process to a species with no prior framework, for it is not a straightforward undertaking. The first 3 elections produced results that the oversight mission and significant portions of the Vreth population rejected for different reasons, which is in some ways an encouraging sign of civic engagement, and in other ways simply evidence that building something new takes longer than anyone expects and fails more often than anyone wants. The 4th election worked, not smoothly, but it worked. A Vreth delegate named Dret Sol was elected to the council's chair. He was 22 years old at the time of the Haddenmere incident and held no position in the government that authorized the strike. He had been, at that time, a student at a technical academy on one of the Middle Ring worlds. He had, according to his own account, and the accounts of people who knew him then, understood immediately and clearly that what his government had done was wrong in a way that could not be reasoned into rightness from any angle. He had said so publicly. It had cost him certain relationships and certain opportunities at the time. I met Dret Sol at a conclave session in the third year after his election. He was quieter than most Vreth I had encountered in formal settings. He asked questions, which is not characteristic Vreth behavior in diplomatic contexts. Vreth tradition favors statements over questions, positions over inquiries. He asked me what I thought the Vreth people needed to genuinely understand in order to build any real future relationship with the rest of the galactic community. I told him the truth. They need to understand that other people's children count, I said, not as an abstract political principle, not as a statement in a treaty document. Concretely, the child in a specific photograph whose specific name you know counts exactly as much as a child of your own species. Until that is not just acknowledged but actually felt, until it is real rather than stated, everything else is a surface structure built on nothing. Dret Sol was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I understood that as a child. I understood it before my government did what it did. The people who made that decision also understood it at some level and decided it did not apply. I know, I said. Does the fact that I understood it matter? He asked. I thought about the question honestly, the way it deserved. It matters for what happens next, I said. It does not change what happened, but it is the difference between a future that is possible and one that is not. A future is built by the people who come after, not undone by the people who came before, as long as the people who come after actually understand what was wrong and why. He nodded. The gesture is not native to Vreth body language. They do not nod, but he had absorbed it from contact with human personnel over the preceding years, the way you absorb the small habits of people you spend real time around, and he used it naturally now without appearing to notice he was doing it. I want to tell you about going back to Haddonmere. It was in the 7th year after the incident. The moon had been resettled 3 years prior, which was a decision that divided opinion sharply among humans both on Earth and across the outer systems. Some believed that a place where something that terrible had happened should not be used again, that the ground should be left alone as a form of permanent acknowledgement. I understand that position. I hold a different one, which is that returning to a place and choosing to build on, it is sometimes the most honest answer you can give to what was taken from you. Not a denial of the loss, an assertion that the loss does not get to be the final statement. The new colony had 11,000 residents when I visited. The farming settlements on the southern shelf were productive again. The town of Caro had been rebuilt approximately 1 kilometer east of its original footprint, which now served as memorial ground. The families of the dead had chosen the site placement themselves and had requested that it not be overly designed, that it look like a place that belonged to the landscape rather than a place constructed for visitors to observe. Someone had planted oak trees in the months before the first families returned. They had been brought from Earth as seedlings, chosen for their adaptability to Haddonmere's light spectrum and gravity, and they had taken more readily than anyone predicted. By the time I arrived, 7 years on, they were substantial enough to cast real shade. I stood underneath them for a while before I went to the stone, because I needed a moment with just the trees and the sound of wind through early leaves before I was ready for the names. The memorial was a single piece of dark stone, roughly rectangular, taller than a standing person, shaped and polished but not finished into smoothness. There was still texture in the surface, the character of the original material preserved. Around its base, the grass grew right up to the edges without being trimmed, because the families had asked specifically for this, that it looked like a place that was part of the world, not a place that was separated from it. The names were carved into all 4 faces of the stone. They were not arranged alphabetically. They were not arranged by age or by settlement or by date. They were arranged by family, which means that where a family had multiple members lost, those names were grouped together, the children's names indented slightly beneath the parents', the visual arrangement making immediately clear what the numbers in reports could never quite make clear, that these were not 4,200 separate incidents. They were families, interrupted mid-sentence. Every name surrounded by the names it had always been surrounded by. I walked around the stone slowly, reading. I did not read every name aloud. I read each one in my mind, which takes longer and carries more weight. I went around all 4 faces before I looked for the specific name I had come to find. Poppy Crane was on the east face in the lower third of the stone. She was listed under her parents, whose names I had not known before I saw them here. Below her parents' names indented was hers, and below hers a symbol, a small clean circle which the memorial committee had selected to mark children under 13. Not a star, not a cross, not anything that claimed to say something about what comes after. A circle, which in human design language means continuation. Something that keeps going. I put my hand flat against her name. I did not say anything out loud. I had not prepared anything to say, which was unusual for me. I am a person whose professional life is built around prepared words. But I had not prepared anything for this moment because I knew that prepared words were the wrong tool for it. I stood with my hand against the carved letters of her name, and I let it be what it was. Real and present and not resolved, and not going to be resolved, and also not the end of anything, because she had existed and built something out of salvaged parts that actually worked and grinned at me with a gap in her teeth, and told me with complete confidence that she was going to design water systems for the outer colony worlds when she grew up. She had existed. That is permanent in the way that the only permanent things are. I stayed at the stone for a long time. The wind moved through the oak trees overhead, and the shadow of the stone shifted slowly across the grass, and at some point I became aware that the knot that had been present in the center of my chest since the morning in the communications bay 10 years ago had loosened slightly. Not gone. Loosened. The difference between a thing that is wound too tight to breathe around and a thing that has settled into the space it occupies and can be lived with. I think that is what Haddenmere gave me standing there. Not resolution, permission to carry it differently. I flew to the conclave station that evening. I slept for 7 hours, which is more than I typically manage, and woke feeling something close to clear. The next morning I gave my annual address to the Conclave Security Council. On the way into the council building, I passed through the main entrance, which is a wide corridor of polished gray composite with light coming in from panels above. At the far end of the corridor, above the door that leads into the working chambers, there is an inscription mounted into the wall. It had been proposed by the Murath Collective in the 2nd year after the conflict, seconded by the Keshari Federation, and passed without a single dissenting vote among all 46 member species. It is carved in Galactic Common Script with translations below it in every member language. I read it every morning when I walked through. I stopped beneath it on that particular morning and read it again with the memory of Haddenmere still in my hands and 7 hours of sleep behind me, and the knowledge that in approximately 40 minutes I would sit down at a table with representatives of 46 civilizations and do the work of trying to make the galaxy slightly less likely to repeat the events that had brought us all here. The inscription said, "Here ends the record of the species that learned too late, and at great cost, that some creatures do not mourn quietly." It is not a warning to humanity. When the Murath delegate proposed it, they were explicit and careful about this. It is a warning about what happens when you mistake another species' patience for permission. It is a reminder, mounted at the entrance of the room where security decisions are made, that grief is not a procedural matter and cannot be handled with the right sequence of formal statements. I read it. I walked inside. The session opened at the scheduled time. I took my seat. Agenda items proceeded in order: 3 routine oversight matters, 2 ongoing process updates, and then the item that Dret Sol had formally submitted for the record through the Vreth Transitional Council's office. It was an education policy document. Dense, bureaucratic, the standard texture of policy writing in any civilization. Its subject was the revision of Vreth standard school curriculum, effective the following academic cycle. The revision included, for the first time in Vreth recorded history, a mandatory unit of study on the Haddonmere incident. Not framed as a military conflict, not framed as a political turning point, framed as a moral lesson. The unit's stated objective, which Dret Sol had written himself and had left unchanged through the full review process, read, students will be able to identify specific individuals lost in the Haddonmere incident, understand the impact of that loss on human civilization and on the broader galactic community, and articulate in their own words why the lives of other species' children are not less real than the lives of their own. I read it twice at the table. Then I read it a third time slowly, to make sure I had read it correctly. I entered my formal vote on the item, approval. I added a note to the official record in my capacity as Human Council representative. The note was short, because the moment called for precision rather than length. It said, humanity acknowledges this development and considers it a meaningful step. We do not consider it sufficient, and we do not expect to consider it sufficient for some time. That is honest. What is also honest is this. It is real, and real things matter, and real things are where everything else eventually has to begin. The council moved to the next item on the agenda. I sat back in my chair and looked at the room around me. 46 species, 1 human, working through a list of necessary tasks, making records that would be consulted by future decision-makers, doing the slow and unglamorous and absolutely essential work of trying to build a structure that might, if everyone present kept paying attention, and no one decided again that some lives were below the threshold of consequence, last long enough to mean something. It was not a clean story. It did not feel like victory. It felt like ongoing work, which is what victory actually feels like when you look at it from inside rather than from a distance. From a distance, endings look like endings. From inside, they look like the beginning of the next set of problems, slightly better shaped than the ones before. I had Poppy Crane's name in my hands from the morning. I had Dret Sol's curriculum language in my eyes from the page. I had Vel Ath's voice in my memory from 10 years ago, saying, "It changes how I see you." I had an inscription above a door that told the galaxy, in 47 languages, what happens when you forget that some creatures do not mourn quietly. And I had a room full of representatives from 46 civilizations who were, all of them, doing the one thing that actually changes anything, paying attention, genuinely paying attention, learning the shape of each other with the specific care that you learn the shape of something you do not intend to break. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough in the absolute sense, the sense that makes the loss of 1,900 children retroactively acceptable, because nothing does that. Nothing should. But it was the truest answer available to the question of what you do after something that cannot be undone. You build what can be built. You carry what must be carried. You stand in front of a stone on a rebuilt moon and put your hand against a name and let it be real. And then you go to the next meeting, and you read the next document, and you make the next argument, and you do the next necessary thing. Because the work does not finish. And because the names carved in dark stone deserve nothing less than the full continuation of the effort to make sure they are the last names carved that way. I knew that. All of us who were there, in that chamber on the day the beacons went silent, knew that. That was never going to change. That was the whole point.